This is a Showmark Bidirectional DigiSpooler 2 floor standing fine filament and optical fiber winding system. I'm going to go over a few of the key features and then go into some detail on the operator interface. So looking at the system, you can see the two red spools on the right and left. Normally with a spooling system, you might define one as a payoff spool and the other as a take-up. On this machine, either side can act as a payoff or take-up since it is bidirectional. And so instead of calling them that, we just call them right and left spools. So each spool is turned by a brushless servo motor on the back side there, right there. And as well, it is carried by a precision ball screw servo-driven actuator acting as a traverse. So depending on which spool is acting as the payoff for the take-up, the payoff side will always be moved by the traverse so that the fiber is paying off at a point in the center line of the path of the machine. And that's determined by this array sensor right here. We have some alignment sensors built into it that detect the position of the fiber coming off of the spool, and it will feed back to the system to move the traverse accordingly to keep the fiber aligned in the center of the machine. So then the fiber will travel down over a guide sheave down to our solid state tension transducer, up through a length tracking system which uses an optical encoder for length measurement, then up over a spring-loaded dampening sheave just to absorb any fluctuations in acceleration or usually due to a poorly wound supply spool. You might get some plucking as it comes off the spool, so that will absorb that plucking, kind of like a dancer arm does on other types of machines. Then on this machine, we come down to a guide sheave, two that are in line to bring the fiber straight across some clamps that are used. They're there for convenience to clamp the fiber down when you want to make a cut. And therefore, once you do make your cut, you don't have to re-thread it all through the other guide pulleys on the machine. So we come through that second guide pulley up to another one, then onto a final guide arm, onto our, in this case, the left spool, which is going to act as the take-up spool. And that one, too, is driven by a servo motor and also carried by a servo-driven traverse unit. And that one will move to maintain the pitch or spacing on the spool as defined in the recipe for this winding. Okay, so then the whole machine is controlled by a dedicated motion controller inside the cabinet there, and also has a PC that's mainly there and from a control standpoint for the sake of controlling the interface. But that PC is also available for the user's application. They can load software in there such as Excel or something, whatever they might need for their application. Okay, so looking at the interface, hopefully this will come through. This is the main screen right here, and it's divided into sections. This column here all pertains to the left spool on the system. Here's the right spool, and then we have some miscellaneous controls there in the center, or on the right of center. And then here to the far side we have a message window and some other function buttons. So, briefly looking at these, we always show the positional rotation of the, there you go, of the each spool, the left and right, and you the ability to jog those at any time. And then below that, you have a window showing the position of the traverses at any given time, and you have jog buttons for either of those. Below the jog buttons are what we call bump buttons, which is a form of a jog button, but they're set up with a defined small incremental move that you can make each time you press that button. So whereas a jog is a little more crude, the bump is a defined jog. Then you have a back and front flange for each button, or I'm sorry, for each spool, and that will simply move the spool to align it, either the back flange or the front flange, with that final guide arm that I showed you previously. Below that, we have homing buttons for each axis, another flange setting button, and then the reference button allows you to change the home positions on the fly while you're winding. So if you find that you're not winding aligned to the flanges or where you want to be, you can tweak it on the fly. And then we also have indicators down below that showing the current states of those alignment sensors that I pointed out earlier too. If I were to block one with my finger, you see it turn off. Okay. Moving over to the system area, these are buttons which we'll press when I do start to initiate the winding. Depending on the circumstances, we'll use either the new payout button or the new take-up button. This isn't really meant to be a training video, so I'm not going to go into complete detail about every one of these. But then we do have some indicators in the or message information in the middle showing the current step within a recipe, which would be entered into the system, showing stops along the way of a current length or of a total length, and just current status. Then in our messaging area, we just show various messages, and the wind, pause, unwind, and reset buttons are the main buttons for initiating motion. Okay, so from here right now, I'm going to go into the system settings screen, where this is just sort of universal variables that are set just for getting the machine set up, such as those bump amounts that I mentioned earlier, the acceleration when it does bump, the amount of gain, and the tension control. There's a few different tension settings in there. We have a low fault limit where in this case we're set for 2 grams. If I want to change it, you just press on it, the keypad comes up, and you can make a change. I'm just going to cancel that though. But in this case, if the tension does go below 2 grams, the machine will give a fault condition. We have traverse limits set there, as well as home positions, and it's really just duplicated on the right side. Over here, we have controls for how the machine comes to a stop, because we can have a very precise creeping type stop if you want a very accurate positioning at the end. We can get down to within a couple millimeters of a desired position. And that's it. I'm going to come out of there, and I'll go into our recipe settings screen. And here is where you will set up a recipe for a spool you're working with. We have really 2 areas, the upper and lower area. Okay, the upper area is again more general type settings. You have your speed, you want to wind at, the pitch setting, which is the spacing between each wind. You set the diameter of the material, the direction, whether you're going left to right or right to left, and you can just toggle that just to change that position. And whether you want to start at the front of the spool or the back of the spool, that would be the initial flange setting. We have our target tension, and the machine, I believe, is set up for 0 to 200 grams of tension. I have to double check that actually. We have spool information, where it's critical obviously for a neat wind to have this accurately entered to know your spool width, the inner diameter and the flange positions, where the spool lands relative to the guide arms on the machine. and that's duplicated for the right side. And up there, target length, that's also, obviously, that's your total length that you want to wind. Okay, so those are sort of general parameters, but then below we have a chart or a matrix where you can enter information about stops along the way. So in this case, if you have a spool that you know you want to make a number of stops at along the total length, you can enter those in there, and it's very easy to do. We have a button here where you can enter the total number of stops you want to make, and just for a demonstration I'll make 4 stops, and that creates a table there with 4 rows. And remembering that our total length is 33 millimeters in this case, what we'll do is for each stop we'll enter the length we want. So stop number 1, let's make that 15, well, already is 15 meters. Number 2, let's make that 25 meters. Number 3, let's make that 30.1, just to be a little more precise. And number 4, the last stop should always be set to 0. And what that does is tells the machine that go to the final length, in this case the 33 meters, and it knows that the winding is complete for this spool. So I'm going to save this recipe. You push Save As and give it a name, and we'll just call it Test. Enter that, and so now it's saved. And one thing you have to remember, it's sort of an interesting function on this machine. Right now you can see we have a cursor right at number 4, which is saying the machine thinks that the next stop is at the end, but we need to press number 1 to tell it that we want to start from the beginning. So I'm going to close the window, and really we're ready to wind. And as I mentioned before, these buttons up here are, depending on the circumstances, you either press new payout or new take up. In this case, we're going to assume that we have a new spool, and so we would press new payout. So there he goes. If we had had a spool on there and we had wound off a certain amount, and then we wanted to start with another empty spool to wind onto, but we kept the original spool as a supply, in that case you'd press new take up. And what that does is it gives you the machine has a smoother start in that case, because it's already determined the proper gearing based on the previous run. But for a new spool you want to press new payout. So we're ready to wind. I'm going to press wind, and we'll see, we'll start going. Okay, and we can see our next stop, if you look at the bottom there, is set for 15 meters. Currently we're at 12.4, 13 meters. It'll slow down twice, and at the very end, as it approaches that 15 meters, it will creep into position until it comes to a pretty accurate stop. And this could be made to creep even more if you wanted to. So there we are, we're 15.02 meters. And you can see the next stop button is flashing, telling you if you want to go to the next move, you press that, and then you'd press wind again. Okay. So in this case, if you wanted to perform some function on the fiber or material, you might lower your clamps into position. They need to be adjusted. We have some tweaking to do here. But they would clamp down the fiber. You might cut it, and then you might even cut an additional length off that you might want, and then pull your new end you created, attach it back onto the spool, and press that next stop button, and then wind from there. So let's just assume I did that. I'll press next stop. and it's telling us that the next stop is at 25 meters. I'll hit wind. So we're winding. And by the way, anytime I want, I can press pause. I can unwind. It's going to pause again. And when it unwinds right back onto the original supply spool with neat and even rows, just like it, as if it were to take up at that point. But I'm going to go back to winding forward, and it will make the next move. So here we are, creeping up to 25. Okay, and ready for our next stop. And press wind. Next stop will be at 30 meters, which is about 2 meters from now. I'm sorry, it wasn't 30 meters, it was that 30.1 meters. And there you can see it's 30.114. So ready for the next stop, which you can see we got a message that all stops complete. The next stop is the final length. So when I press wind, it will know just to go to that final length of 33. I'm going to pause it, do a little unwind. Oop. And just to show, we have a few safeties or faults that can occur on the machine. One would be if you set a speed that was too fast for the system, it would not be able to reach that speed, and it would fault out and then indicate to you that you exceeded the speed capabilities. And then you just hit reset and enter a lower speed, and it will just resume from there. Also, if at any time, as I mentioned, the tension drops too low or breaks, literally, you'll get a fault condition, as well as if the fiber came out of the length tracker and it wasn't counting, it would detect that and stop as well. We also have e-stop on here. Now the e-stop truly is an emergency stop. So if you press it, you lose your spool you're winding, you lose the information. So we have our pause on the screen for normal pausing and stopping. But if you have a true emergency, I'll press it right now, and you'll see we actually get a timeout error on the system, and it's a fatal crash at that point. So that's the machine. If there's any questions, we can be reached at 610-458-0304 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.